May 20th, 1940. Northern France, 15 kilometers south of Dunkirk. The temperature was 16 degrees Celsius, and smoke from burning vehicles filled the air when nursing Sister Agnes Warner stood in the courtyard of a makeshift field hospital and watched German tanks approaching. Warner was 34 years old, a Canadian military nurse serving with No. 10 Canadian General Hospital, and she had approximately 20 minutes before German forces overran her position. The hospital contained 47 wounded Canadian and British soldiers who could not be evacuated. Warner's commanding officer, Major Robert Chen, had ordered all mobile personnel to evacuate immediately. Warner refused. She told Chen she was staying with the wounded. Chen said staying meant certain capture or death. Warner said leaving meant the wounded would die without medical care. She was staying. Agnes Warner came from Gaspé, Quebec. Her father was Scottish, her mother was French-Canadian. Warner grew up bilingual, speaking English with her father and French with her mother. She also learned German in school. Gaspé had a small German immigrant community, and Warner's best friend as a child was the daughter of a German shopkeeper. By age 18, Warner spoke English, French, and German fluently. She studied nursing at McGill University and worked at Montreal General Hospital for 10 years before enlisting in the Canadian Army Medical Corps in 1939. Warner deployed to France in February 1940 with No. 10 Canadian General Hospital. When Germany invaded in May, Allied forces were pushed back toward the English Channel. By May 19th, the hospital received evacuation orders. All mobile patients would be transported to Dunkirk. The hospital would be abandoned. But 47 patients were too severely wounded to move, amputees recovering from surgery, soldiers with abdominal wounds, men with head injuries. Moving them would likely kill them. Warner was assigned to evacuate with the main hospital group. She looked at the 47 wounded soldiers who would be left behind. One soldier, a private from Toronto named James Morrison, looked at her and said, "You're leaving us." Morrison was 19 years old with shrapnel wounds in his abdomen. Without medical care, he would die within days. Warner looked at the other 46 wounded. She made her decision. She told Major Chen she was staying. Chen argued. Warner refused to change her mind. Chen left with the evacuation convoy. Warner was now alone with 47 wounded soldiers and German forces approaching. At 14:30 hours on May 20th, German forces arrived. Warner heard vehicles, boots on stairs. German soldiers entered the ward. Here, regular army, not SS. A sergeant entered first, weapon ready. He saw a woman in a nursing uniform standing among wounded soldiers. He lowered his rifle and spoke in German. "Who are you?" Warner responded in German. "Ich bin Krankenschwester. Diese Männer sind verwundet." "I am a nurse. These men are wounded." The sergeant was surprised to hear German. "Sie sind Deutsche? You are German?" This was the critical moment. Warner said, "Ich bin Elsässerin. I am Alsatian." Alsace was a region on the French-German border where many spoke German. Claiming to be Alsatian explained her German fluency and her presence in a French hospital. The sergeant called his commanding officer. Lieutenant Klaus Zimmermann arrived. He was 38 years old, a career officer from Hamburg. Zimmermann looked at Warner and spoke in rapid German. "You're Alsatian? From which town?" "Strasbourg," Warner said. "Strasbourg is a large city. Which district?" Warner's mind raced. She had never been to Strasbourg, but had read about it. "Quartier de la Gare, near the cathedral." "The cathedral dominates the city centre, not Gare district," Zimmermann said. "And Gare is the train station area, mostly commercial. Strange place to live." Warner forced herself to stay calm. "My father worked at the station." We lived nearby for convenience. Zimmerman studied her. What was your father's occupation? Station master's clerk. And you speak French? Of course. Alsace is French territory. Zimmerman switched to French. Alors, parlez-moi de votre formation d'infirmière. So, tell me about your nursing training. Warner responded in fluent French. J'ai étudié à l'hôpital de Strasbourg pendant 3 ans. I studied at Strasbourg Hospital for 3 years. Zimmerman switched back to German. Why did you stay when the other medical staff evacuated? These men cannot be moved. Someone must care for them. They are enemy soldiers. They are wounded men who need medical care. Zimmerman examined the wounded soldiers. He noted their severe wounds, many unconscious, clearly unable to evacuate. He was skeptical about Warner, but also practical. These wounded prisoners needed medical care. Warner was a trained nurse, willing to provide it. Interrogating her further would take time he didn't have. He made a decision. You will continue caring for these men. We will position guards outside. You will report to me daily on their condition. Understood? Understood. Zimmerman left soldiers to guard the building and departed. Warner was stunned. She had passed the interrogation. The Alsatian deception had worked. She was now responsible for 47 wounded soldiers in German-occupied territory, pretending to be someone she wasn't. Over the next week, Warner established a routine. Each morning she checked every patient, changed bandages, administered medications. The German guards watched suspiciously initially, but gradually accepted her. Warner maintained her Alsatian identity by speaking only German or French when guards were present. The wounded soldiers presented a different problem. Most were too injured to speak. But Morrison was conscious enough to understand the situation. He whispered to Warner in English, "You're pretending to be German?" Warner whispered back, "Alsatian." Stay quiet about it. Why are they letting you stay? Because they think I'm Alsatian. If they knew I was Canadian, this ends. Morrison understood. He told other conscious patients to stay quiet. There were 3 others aware enough to understand. William Hayes, a 42-year-old British corporal with leg wounds, Thomas Brennan, a 24-year-old Canadian private with a chest wound, and Robert Sullivan, a 31-year-old British lance corporal with severe burns. These 4 became Warner's allies, helping maintain the deception by staying silent about her nationality. By the 4th day, supplies were running low. Warner told Lieutenant Zimmerman she needed morphine, bandages, antiseptic. Zimmerman said he would try to obtain supplies. 2 days later, German medical supplies arrived, enough to continue treating patients. This created Warner's first ethical crisis. She was a Canadian nurse, using German medical supplies to treat Allied soldiers. She was cooperating with enemy forces. When she administered German morphine to Morrison to ease his pain, Morrison asked, "Is it strange using their supplies?" Warner said quietly, "It's necessary. You need morphine. I don't care where it comes from. Some people would say you're collaborating. Some people aren't trying to keep you alive." On June 3rd, a German medical officer visited to inspect the facility. Dr. Heinrich Müller was 41 years old, a Bavarian physician. Müller examined several patients and questioned Warner about treatments. Warner answered in German, explaining her procedures. Müller seemed satisfied until he noticed how Warner bandaged a wound. "That's an interesting technique," Müller said. "I haven't seen that method before. Where did you learn it?" Warner froze internally. She had used a bandaging method from McGill University, a Canadian technique. She improvised. "I trained with a French surgeon who studied in America. He taught me American hospital methods." Müller accepted this but looked at Warner thoughtfully. "You're very skilled for someone who trained in Strasbourg. The technique suggests advanced surgical training." "I sought additional training when opportunities arose." Müller nodded, but Warner could tell he was slightly suspicious. She became more careful about every procedure, every technique, making sure nothing revealed her actual training background. That evening, Hayes asked to speak with Warner privately. Hayes had been a soldier in World War I and had re-enlisted in 1939. He was perceptive and had been watching Warner carefully. He said quietly, "You're not Alsatian, are you?" Warner considered lying, but decided trust was necessary. "No." "Canadian?" "Yes." "Why are you really staying? You could have evacuated." Warner looked at Hayes. "You and 46 other men would have died without care. I'm a nurse. Leaving seemed wrong. Most nurses would have followed orders. I couldn't." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "I won't tell the Germans. Neither will the others who know. You're taking a huge risk staying here pretending to be someone else. That deserves loyalty." Hayes became Warner's confidant over the following weeks. When Warner was stressed about maintaining the deception, she could talk quietly with Hayes. When she worried about a patient's deteriorating condition, Hayes listened. This psychological support was invaluable. Warner was isolated, constantly performing a role, unable to relax. Having one person who knew the truth helped her cope. By mid-June, the military situation had stabilized. France had surrendered. Warner's hospital was deep in German-occupied territory. German forces began transferring recovered prisoners to POW camps. Warner advocated with Zimmermann to delay transfers for critically wounded patients. Zimmermann agreed. Patients would not be moved until stable enough to survive transport. But stabilization meant eventual transfer. Warner watched as patients recovered and left. Morrison was transferred in early July. Before leaving, he whispered, "Thank you for staying. You didn't have to." Warner said, "Yes, I did." Over the summer, 11 patients died despite Warner's care. Their wounds were too severe. Warner sat with each dying patient, providing comfort when nothing else could be done. One patient, Thomas Brennan, the 24-year-old Canadian with chest wounds, died on July 14th. Warner had spent hours with Brennan over 6 weeks. She had changed his bandages daily, administered morphine, talked with him about his family in Saskatchewan. When he died, Warner sat beside his bed for an hour, grief washing over her. She couldn't show this grief to German guards. She had to maintain her professional Alsatian nurse persona. She waited until night, when guards were less attentive. Then she allowed herself to cry quietly in the small office. Hayes found her there. He didn't say anything. He just sat with her until she was ready to return to work. By August, 20 patients had been transferred to POW camps. 16 remained too injured to move. Warner continued caring for them, using dwindling German supplies, maintaining her deception constantly. The psychological strain was immense. She couldn't relax. Every word had to be considered. Every action had to fit the Alsatian nurse identity. The stress caused insomnia and weight loss. Hayes noticed and urged her to rest more. Warner said she would rest when the patients were safe. In late August, an unexpected complication arose. A German soldier was injured in an accident, crushed by a falling supply crate. German medical personnel were unavailable. Lieutenant Zimmermann asked Warner to treat the German soldier. Warner faced an ethical choice. She was pretending to be Alsatian specifically to care for Allied wounded. Treating a German soldier felt like actual collaboration rather than pragmatic necessity. But refusing would raise suspicions about her motives and potentially expose her deception. She agreed to treat the German soldier. She set his broken arm and bandaged his injuries professionally. The soldier thanked her in German. Warner said it was her duty. Internally, she felt conflicted. She had just provided medical care to an enemy soldier while Allied wounded remained in her care. Hayes asked her later, "How do you feel about treating him?" Warner said, "Conflicted, that he was injured and I'm a nurse. That's what nurses do. Even for the enemy? Medical ethics don't stop because someone is on the other side. This incident reinforced Warner's understanding that her situation was ethically complex. She was lying, collaborating, and operating outside any clear moral framework. She was doing what she believed necessary to save her patients. Whether this was right or wrong was something she couldn't fully answer. She just knew she couldn't do anything different. By October 1940, Warner had been maintaining her Alsatian deception for 5 months. The strain was showing. She was exhausted, stressed, and running low on emotional reserves. Then, German military police arrived, demanding to see her identification papers. October 15th, 1940. A German military policeman stood in Warner's hospital ward demanding identification papers. Warner had no papers. She had been operating on the assumption that her nursing uniform and Lieutenant Zimmerman's authorization were sufficient. The policeman said all personnel in German-occupied territory required proper identification. Warner said she was Alsatian and her papers were lost during the evacuation. The policeman said she needed to report to German administrative offices to obtain replacement papers immediately. Warner knew this was dangerous. Administrative offices would ask detailed questions she couldn't answer convincingly. They would want her place of birth, family details, previous employment, information that could be cross-referenced. Her deception would likely be discovered. She had 3 options: report and risk exposure, refuse and be arrested immediately, or escape and abandon the 16 remaining patients. Warner couldn't abandon her patients. She decided to report and hoped she could maintain her deception through interrogation. October 18th, 1940. Warner sat in a German administrative office in Arras, facing a clerk named Otto Fischer. Fischer was methodical and thorough. He asked Warner's name. Warner said Agnes Richter, using her middle name and inventing the German surname. Fischer asked her place of birth. Warner said Strasbourg, Alsace. Fischer asked her date of birth, parents' names, occupation, education, employment history. Warner answered each question, creating a fictional but plausible background as she spoke. Then Fischer asked, "Do you have baptismal records?" Warner said her records were lost when she evacuated. Fischer said replacement records could be requested from Strasbourg churches. This would take several weeks. Warner would receive temporary papers valid for 60 days. After 60 days, she must provide proper documentation or face arrest. Warner left with temporary papers identifying her as Agnes Richter, Alsatian nurse. The papers expired December 8th. She had 60 days before her deception would certainly be discovered. She returned to the hospital and said nothing to her patients about the deadline. Over the following 3 weeks, 4 more patients recovered enough to be transferred. 12 remained. Warner focused on keeping these 12 alive while the clock ticked down. She administered morphine to those in pain, changed bandages, provided what nutrition she could. She spent long hours sitting with conscious patients. Hayes remained her primary support. When Warner was visibly stressed, Hayes would talk to her quietly, reminding her that she had already saved 35 patients and that what she was doing mattered, regardless of how it ended. In early November, Warner received notice that her temporary papers would be inspected by German military police on November 28th. The inspection would verify she was making progress obtaining proper documentation. Warner had made no progress because she couldn't. She had 3 weeks before the inspection would expose her deception. Warner wrote a letter to Major Chen, her commanding officer who had evacuated in May. She had no way to send the letter, but writing helped her process the situation. She wrote, "Major Chen, I stayed with the wounded as I said I would. 47 patients initially. 11 died despite my care. 24 recovered enough to be transferred to POW camps. 12 remain under my care. I have been pretending to be Alsatian for 6 months. German authorities are requesting documentation I cannot provide. I will likely be arrested within 3 weeks." I don't regret staying. These men needed care, and I provided it. If I am arrested, I hope someone continues their care. Agnes Warner. She folded the letter and placed it in her pocket. Writing it provided clarity about what mattered. She had saved 35 of 47 patients. Whatever happened next, that was accomplished. November 28th arrived. German military police conducted their inspection. A policeman asked to see Warner's identification progress. Warner said the process was delayed. Records from Strasbourg were taking longer than expected. The policeman noted that Warner's temporary papers would expire in 10 days. He said Warner needed to resolve this immediately or face arrest for operating without proper identification. After the inspection, Warner understood she had perhaps 2 weeks before arrest. She needed an escape plan. But escaping meant abandoning 12 patients, 3 of whom would die without continued care. Warner couldn't abandon dying patients. She would stay until arrested. Whatever consequences followed, she would accept them. December 7th, 1940. Warner prepared for the worst. She wrote detailed medical notes for each patient, documenting their conditions and treatment requirements. She hoped German medical personnel would continue treating them after her arrest. She spoke to each conscious patient, explaining she would likely be arrested soon. Hayes said, "You gave us 6 months we wouldn't have had. 35 men are alive because you stayed. That's not nothing." Warner said, "It was what needed to be done. Most people wouldn't have done it. I'm not most people." Warner prepared to report to German administrative offices on December 9th when her papers expired. Then, on December 8th, something unexpected happened. British forces launched a major offensive in North Africa, attacking Italian forces at Sidi Barrani. The offensive was successful and created panic in Axis forces. Germany immediately redirected resources to support Italy. Medical units in France received orders to prepare for North Africa deployment. Dr. Heinrich Müller, the German medical officer who had inspected Warner's hospital in June, returned on December 8th. Müller said he was deploying to North Africa and needed to transfer all wounded prisoners to a central German medical facility before leaving. The transfer would happen immediately. Warner asked what would happen to the patients. Müller said they would be treated at the central facility until recovered enough for POW camp transfer. Warner asked what would happen to her. Müller looked at her thoughtfully. "Administrative records show your papers expired yesterday. Normally, this means arrest. But I need your assistance transferring these patients. They trust you. The transfer will be easier with your help." Warner waited. Müller continued, "If you help with the transfer, I'll provide you with a travel pass. The pass will authorize you to travel to Strasbourg to obtain proper documentation. What you do with that pass afterward is your concern." Warner understood what Müller was offering: help with the transfer and receive a document that could facilitate escape. Müller either didn't care that her documentation was false or was willing to overlook it. Warner agreed immediately. Over the next 2 days, Warner helped transfer all 12 patients to the central German medical facility. The transfers were difficult. Several patients were still critical, but Warner ensured each was stabilized before transport. She said goodbye to Hayes on December 10th. Hayes whispered, "You saved my life by staying. I'll remember that." Müller provided Warner with the travel pass as promised. The pass authorized Agnes Richter to travel from Arras to Strasbourg. Müller said, "I don't know who you really are, and I don't care. But you stayed with wounded prisoners when your own forces abandoned them. That deserves recognition. Use this pass to get wherever you're going. Just don't get caught." Warner thanked Müller and left on December 11th. She had a travel pass, minimal money, and the clothes she wore. She also had her letter to Major Chen and medical notes from 6 months treating wounded soldiers. The escape. Warner didn't travel to Strasbourg. She traveled southwest toward unoccupied France, the zone controlled by Vichy French government, technically neutral. Her plan was to reach the unoccupied zone and make contact with resistance networks. The journey was more difficult than anticipated. Warner traveled by train where possible, by foot when necessary. Her travel pass worked at most checkpoints. German soldiers saw official documentation and let her proceed. But on December 15th, she encountered a problem. At a checkpoint near Reims, a German sergeant examined her pass carefully.
This pass authorizes travel to Strasbourg. You're traveling southwest. Why? Warner improvised. I'm visiting family in Lyon before continuing to Strasbourg. The pass doesn't authorize Lyon. I didn't realize I needed specific authorization for family visits. The sergeant was suspicious. He called his superior officer, a lieutenant who examined the pass and questioned Warner in rapid German about her background. Warner maintained her Alsatian identity, answering questions about Strasbourg, her family, her work. The lieutenant seemed satisfied initially. Then he asked a question Warner hadn't anticipated. You worked in a hospital near Arras for 6 months. Which specific hospital? Warner said, the facility in the former school building, 3 kilometers south of the town center. I'm from Arras, the lieutenant said. There is no school building 3 kilometers south of town center. The school is northeast. Warner's mind raced. She had described the location incorrectly. She said, I apologize. I meant northeast. Geography isn't my strength. The lieutenant studied her. A nurse who worked somewhere for 6 months should know which direction it was from town. Warner said nothing. The lieutenant looked at her travel pass, then at Warner. Finally, he said, Papers seem in order. Proceed. The lieutenant let her go. Warner didn't understand why. She suspected he had doubts, but chose not to pursue them. She boarded a train and left Rennes quickly. On December 20th, Warner reached the demarcation line between occupied and unoccupied France. The border was heavily guarded. Warner's travel pass authorized movement within occupied France, but not crossing into unoccupied territory. Crossing legally was impossible. She would need to cross illegally. Warner waited until nightfall and approached the border area on foot. She could see German border guards patrolling with searchlights. The demarcation line ran through farmland with minimal cover. Crossing would require timing and luck. Warner watched the patrol patterns for 2 hours, noting the gaps between patrols. At 0200 hours, she crossed. She ran across open farmland during a gap between patrols, expecting searchlights or gunfire at any moment. Neither came. She reached the unoccupied zone and collapsed in a field, exhausted and terrified. She had made it. Over the following week, Warner traveled through unoccupied France, asking discreetly about resistance networks or people helping refugees. On December 28th, she met a Catholic priest in a small village. The priest was Father Michel Dubois, age 58, who operated a safe house network smuggling people to Spain. Dubois was initially suspicious. He asked Warner who she was and why she needed help. Warner was exhausted and decided honesty was necessary. She identified herself as a Canadian military nurse who had been trapped in occupied France since May 1940. She showed Dubois her medical notes and the letter to Major Chen. Dubois read the documents carefully. You stayed with wounded enemy soldiers for 6 months. They were my patients. That's either brave or foolish. Both, Warner said. Dubois helped Warner travel to Spain in January 1941. The journey through the Pyrenees Mountains was brutal. Warner and a group of refugees crossed at night in freezing temperatures. The climb took 12 hours. One refugee collapsed from exhaustion and hypothermia. Warner used her medical training to stabilize him enough to continue. The group reached Spain on January 15, 1941. From Spain, Warner traveled to Portugal and eventually reached Britain in March 1941. She had been missing and presumed dead for 10 months. When she reported to Canadian military authorities in London, they were shocked. Major Chen was summoned to verify her identity. Chen saw Warner and was speechless. Finally, he said, "Sister Warner, I didn't think you could possibly survive."
How many patients did you save? 36 out of 47, Warner said. 11 died despite my care. Chen said Warner's actions would be investigated to determine if she violated military regulations by refusing evacuation orders. The investigation took 3 months. Authorities concluded that Warner had technically violated orders, but had acted with extraordinary courage and dedication. Rather than court-martial her, they awarded her the military medal. Warner remained in the Canadian Army Medical Corps for the rest of the war, serving in Britain and Italy. She never spoke publicly about the 6 months in occupied France. When asked, she would say only that she stayed with wounded patients who couldn't be evacuated. Aftermath and legacy. Warner returned to Canada in 1945 and resumed working at Montreal General Hospital. She married in 1947, had 2 children, and worked as a nurse until retiring in 1970. She rarely discussed her war service. In 1987, William Hayes published a memoir titled Surviving France, 1940. The memoir included a chapter about Warner. Hayes described how Warner stayed with wounded prisoners, pretended to be Alsatian for 6 months, and risked execution to continue providing care. Hayes wrote, "Sister Warner saved my life by staying. She could have evacuated safely, but chose to stay with us instead. For 6 months she maintained a constant deception, never relaxing, never making a slip, always aware that exposure meant death. She did this because we were her patients, and that was sufficient reason." The memoir brought attention to Warner's story. In 1988, James Morrison, now 66 years old, wrote to Warner, thanking her for staying. His letter said, "Sister Warner, I was 19 and scared, and didn't think I would survive. You stayed anyway. I've had 48 years of life because you refused to leave. I wanted you to know that your choice to stay mattered." Warner responded, "Mr. Morrison, I'm glad you survived and had a good life. I stayed because you needed care. This seemed obvious to me. Best wishes." In 1992, a German historian contacted Warner asking about Dr. Heinrich Müller. The historian had discovered that Müller gave Warner travel papers in December 1940. The historian asked why Müller helped her. Warner said, "Dr. Müller recognized that I stayed with wounded prisoners when I could have evacuated. He appreciated this, even though the prisoners were enemy soldiers. His willingness to provide travel papers probably saved my life." The historian located information about Müller. German records showed Müller served in North Africa until captured by British forces in May 1943. After the war, he returned to Bavaria and resumed practicing medicine until his death in 1979. Warner died in 1989 at age 83. Her obituary mentioned her military medal, but not the full circumstances. The meaning. Warner stayed with 47 wounded soldiers for 6 months, pretending to be Alsatian, risking execution daily, cooperating with enemy forces, and saving 36 lives through constant deception and ethical compromise. The lesson is about the conflict between following orders and following ethical obligations. Warner was ordered to evacuate. Following orders would have been safe and justified, but following orders meant abandoning 47 wounded soldiers. Warner chose to violate orders and stay. This choice required lying about her identity, cooperating with German forces, and enduring extreme psychological stress. These actions could be viewed as collaboration or as pragmatic necessity. Warner viewed them as tools to achieve her goal, saving patients. The deception and cooperation were means to an end. Warner also violated military authority by refusing orders. But she wasn't making a statement about authority. She was making a practical decision. Her patients needed care. She could provide care. Therefore, she stayed. What makes Warner's story remarkable is maintaining deception for 6 months under conditions that would break most people. Pretending to be someone else constantly, never relaxing, always aware that exposure meant death. This required extraordinary discipline. The patients she saved recognized this. Morrison's letter, 48 years later, captured the impact. Warner's choice gave 36 men decades of life they wouldn't have had otherwise. Warner never framed her choice as heroic. She framed it as obvious. Patients needed care. She was a nurse. She provided care. The complications, pretending to be Alsatian, cooperating with Germans, risking execution, were practical problems to manage, not evidence of exceptional courage. Sometimes doing what seems obvious requires extraordinary courage. Sometimes following ethical obligations requires violating formal rules. Sometimes saving lives requires deception and compromise. Warner understood this and proceeded anyway. She saved 36 of 47 patients by staying when she could have left. That was sufficient justification for everything else. The patients lived. That was what mattered.